My name is BenitoTrevino Jr. I was born and raised here in Rio Grande City in Starr County. My grandparents on my father's side, well, my grandfather was a wagon master, and he made his life. He raised, of course, lots of horses because they needed horses, and he would take wagons from Rio Grande City and the surrounding area, any goods that they had, cotton or any products, and he would take them to the port of Brownsville and deliver them to be shipped out. And then he would bring back sugar and rice and other items. As a result, he had to read the land like we read a book. He had to know exactly, they spent a lot of times out here in the woods when they were grazing their livestock, and they sometimes spent months here without going to town. So if they had any medicinal problems, whatever, they couldn't afford to go to town, and sometimes the things that they needed were not in town anyway. So they learned how to use the land for what they needed. My other grandfather was a farmer, and he too would spend long hours out in the fields, and he too had learned how to eat stuff from the woods, and if he had a headache, how to take remedies from native plants. I grew up learning from both my grandparents and my grandmothers, my aunt and my mother. I didn't learn how to prepare the things. I didn't learn what it was used for. I mainly learned how to recognize it and how to harvest it. A lot of times I had no idea what I was doing. I was simply told, my mother would say, Benito, could you go to the river and get some willow bark? And on the way back, could you stop and get me some mesquite bark and collect some cactus root for me? So my brothers and I, my younger brothers, I come from a large family, there's 13 of us in my family. We'd, make it a trip, go to the river and harvest whatever she needed, and we'd deliver to them, and we went on our ways. We were young. And this went on a lot. All throughout my childhood period, I would do these things. We were always migrant workers. We would migrate North Texas, East Texas, California, harvesting, following the crops. So I was always involved with plants in one form or another. And I grew a very strong attachment to plants in general. When I graduated from high school and decided that being a migrant worker was just extremely, it was a trap. We were extremely poor, never had enough money to do anything to better ourselves. So I decided that the way out of this trap was to get an education. And I attended UT Austin, and I majored in botany with a minor in chemistry. Prior to this, actual chemistry meant very little to me. I never had it in high school, but I couldn't get a degree in botany not knowing chemistry, so I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot about the chemistry. And then I went on my way like everybody else does. Okay, I have a degree now, I can go out and work and make money. And I did. My wife and I, she also has a degree, so we went on like a typical life. And after like 10 years of following this dream of, living up to the standards of everybody else and keeping up with the Joneses and stuff, we realized that we were missing out. We're doing this because, that's the thing to do after you get out of college, you do these things. But we were really not, this is not what we want to do. So we made a decision to leave our very nice jobs that we had to kind of like poverty again, but enrich our lives by doing and enjoying and teaching others the life that I had learned when I was a young kid, what my grandfathers had endured, what they had learned, what they had taught me, and placing a much higher value on this that we have here than to have money in the bank and drive a nice vehicle. So since around 1988, all these little bits of information that I had that I didn't connect, I'd go back to my parents, my mother, my grandfather, and say, Dad, you know, why was I collecting this? And from him, because a lot of the stuff that I know is not on books. I myself have gone to libraries to research some of these things to find out, did other people use it? And there's simply not anything on the literature. Some of the remedies that my mother said when she asked me to go to the river and collect these items, I didn't know that I was going to the river to collect willow, which is Salicylic niagara, or Silex niagara. I was collecting the bark of the river willow because salicylic acid, a main ingredient in aspirin, is a derivative from the willow tree. So my mother was asking me, go get me salicylic acid from the willow. On the way back, I need a flavoring agent, so stop and get me some mesquite bark to give it flavor and color. And then I need a buffering solution, get me some cactus root, and I'll use that as a buffering solution. And then I'll boil all these ingredients together, and I'll give you a very good tasting, very buffered aspirin. I mean, these people had like PhDs without them knowing, a laboratory right there in their own kitchens. So I became really interested in ethnobotany, and I followed that career, and that's where I'm at today. I managed to connect a lot of these dots that before they were scattered pieces of information and put them together, and now I know that when my grandparents or my aunts or somebody were out here working, they didn't have a good water source. The only water source was a pond or a creek, and they went and drank some water from an arroyo or a presa, and they had a disease that involved a mild fever, headache, lots of diarrhea. They would go and collect a certain plant and make a tea out of it. Well, the disease had a name. It was amoebic dysentery. It was produced by an amoeba, and the plant, which now has been proven, was all-thorn goat bush, or amargoso, amargosa, or besberinda, all common names. They were preparing a tea made from this specific plant, like 1 handful to about 3 cups of water. They would boil it, and then they would drink it, unsugared. They wouldn't use sugar or honey simply because it didn't make a difference. This thing is horrible. It lives up to its name, amargoso or amargosa. It's extremely bitter. If I could associate it with something, I would say it's like drinking battery acid. This is horrible. But it has been tested in the laboratory, and a 1 part per million extract from this concoction paralyzes the amoebas. So they would make a tea, they would drink it like 3 times a day, and within a couple of days, you're back at work. Your diarrhea has stopped, your fever has gone down, and you're back in shape. So they had the supermarket, they had the pharmacy, they had herbal teas, they had everything right here. One of the medicinal plants that is still used today is Texas silver sage, or cenizo. And this particular plant, if you had, in the winter, if you came down with a cold, and you had a lot of congestion, sinus congestion, accompanied with a headache and all the symptoms, you would use cenizo. Again, a handful to about 3 cups of water. You would boil the water, put the cenizo cuttings, you would cut it, leaves, twigs, everything. You would boil it for about 3 minutes, and then while it was still nice and hot, you would pour it, and you would put sugar, if you had sugar, or honey, if you had honey. You would flavor it either way, and then you would drink it. Amazing. Much better than BC powder or Alka-Seltzer or Tylenol. This thing really, really works. And one of the things that has been found out in recent years is that some of the things they flavored with honey and sugar, others they didn't. And even that little act had a meaning behind it, because apparently sugar has a certain chemistry, and these plants have a certain chemistry, and it's the combination of the chemistry from the sugar and the chemistry from the plant that gives it its effectiveness. If you were to drink it without sugar, it wouldn't be as effective. Another thing that sugar had was you're sick. Your appetite is gone. You feel horrible. So when they flavored these things with sugar, other than introducing the chemistry, it also gave you some energy. Sugar immediately gets into your system and it gives you energy. Hopefully it would increase your appetite, and it would send you on your way to recovery. Honey would do the same things. So it's amazing how all these things that appear cloudy or ambiguous, actually they have reasons. Every little thing had a reason. How did they know that these things worked? I imagine through trial and error. Some of it, maybe it made sense if a plant was edible and it gave you energy and maybe you felt good. Maybe they followed that. You know, when I ate this plant, I felt good, but I also had a little headache and it went away. So next time, maybe they said, well, try that. It helped you. There were specific things that they used for specific things, even though they were close together, and illness might be close together. You know, sometimes we fail to recognize that you can get a cold and you might not get a lot of sinus congestion and headache and runny nose. Maybe you have chest that's really congested. You still have a runny nose, but it's mainly not your sinus, but your chest. All the symptoms are the same. Well, as I said with cenizo, if you had sinus, a lot of drainage and sinus congestion, they would use cenizo. But if you had all the same symptoms, but it was accompanied by a lot of congestion in your chest, then they would use Mexican olive or anacahuita. This particular anacahuita happens to have blooms. Where that bloom is, in a few more weeks, there's going to be a little olive-shaped fruit. If I was to get a cold and I'd go out to the woods and I would find some anacahuita that had flowers, leaves, and fruit, I would collect all of them. And I would bring them back. I would put a pot of water, and I'd get it boiling, and I would drop all the fruit into the water and let it boil for a few minutes. Then I would cut leaves, maybe some of the fruit, some of the twigs and the blooms, and I would make a tea out of that combination. And again, I would sweeten it with a little bit of sugar. While it was still hot, I would remove the berries from my boiling water and I would mash them. And I would make a paste that would look like masa, like dough. And I would apply that to whoever was ill on the chest. I would cover it. And then I would give them a tea made from the anacahuita. And just like cenizo, it would help my headache. It would clear my little drainage that I had. And it would just make me breathe and feel so much better because it would get rid of the congestion, the chest congestion. So here they are, two diseases that have slightly different symptoms, and they were very specific to use two different plants to take care of that specific problem. Let's say my grandfather was a wagon master and he was hooking up his mules to the wagon, and he got kicked by the mule, knocked him down, made a huge bruise on his leg or in his arm or in his chest. Well, what are you going to do? You're caught up here in the monte, nobody to help you, a day's ride to town. You can't afford to miss work because things are real difficult and you need to get things done every day. Well, because they knew the area, not only did they know the plants, but they knew where things grow. So he would think, I need manzanita. And I know that on El Arroyo there's a manzanita growing. So if he could, he would go to the arroyo or to the ramadero or wherever he knew that manzanita was growing, and he would collect this particular plant. This is called Barbados cherry in English, and it's called manzanita in Spanish. It's a native plant. It grows wild. It has a very wide area where it can tolerate extreme dryness, so you would find it in a gravelly slope. And it can also take moisture, so you would find it in low-lying areas along creek bottoms or along the river. What this particular plant does, and the way it would be used, is he would strip all the leaves from the plant. If he had water, he would moisten them in water. He would put them in a little vessel with water. He would take his canteen and put it in a cup with a little bit of water, and he would break them up as best as he could, and he would put them in just a small amount of water and let them soak there for a little bit. If he didn't have water, he would take the leaves and he would chew them up, break them all up, and then he would put them somewhere for just a couple of minutes, and then he would apply this to the area where he had been kicked, or if he fell and he got bruised real bad. It was not used for cuts or abrasions. It was used for bruises. You know how a bruise, when you get hit, if you get hit real hard, of course it swells. If it bursts the blood vessels, so then it starts to turn that ugly purplish blue color, and then later yellow and brownish, all kinds of colors. Well, manzanita has a chemical substance that is like Motrin. It's an anti-inflammatory. So when they would apply it, the reason they would chew on it, or they would put in a little bit of water, is to release the anti-inflammatory substance in the leaf. It gives you a much faster relief, because you're actually introducing the leaves into this moist environment. The enzymes in your mouth also help it break up. So you would apply it to your thing, you would bandage it, and within a couple of hours, you would take it off, no more swelling, it's gone. Of course, you would leave it on and you could just go back to work. In England, where this plant grows, they have the same use, but they use it slightly different. Instead of using the leaves, they use the bark. They would take a knife and get the bark, and they would use it the same as the leaf, and they call it Nance bark in England. That's how they would go to a pharmacy, and if they had that inflammation, they would use Nance bark. Here, it's called manzanita or Barbados cherry. By the way, it produces red fruit, and the red fruit also works for the inflammation, but it's also edible. So they could eat the fruit. If enough of it was around, they would harvest the fruit and they would make jelly out of it. Jellies were one easy way, and drying things were one easy way of harvesting what was available whenever it was available and preserving it for long-term use. A jelly, because it has a substantial amount of sugar, prevents bacteria from growing. Sugars and salts prevent bacteria. When you put sugar in a solution, liquids want to travel from a high concentration to a low concentration to get equilibrium. So you have a bacteria and you have a surrounding area with high sugar concentration. Sugar goes where the bacteria wants it or not. It penetrates into the bacteria to get equilibrium. The bacteria starts to swell and bursts, so it kills it. Salts have the opposite effect. If you have bacteria and you have a little bit of water and you put salt, it sucks the juice out of the bacteria and it kills it. So those two things, either for drying they use salts, or for preserving they use sugar. And of course the natural sugars that already were contained in the plant were also useful in preserving if they couldn't add more things to it. One of our local trees, native trees, that was extremely important for many uses. You could use this as a medicinal plant. For that, you would use the leaves of the mesquite. You would collect a whole bunch of leaves. You would immerse them in a vessel. It could be a glass or a tin can with water. And you would let them soak overnight. And if you had real bad eye irritation, where now we use murine or eye drops or whatever, you would use this to take care of that. It would remove the irritation, and it would take the pain away, and you would be back in shape. How they would do it, they didn't have a little eyedropper, of course. They could just simply wet a piece of cloth and then squeeze the drops into the eye, and you would work them into your eye. You know, just 3 or 4 drops would do it, and then your vision would get better. The irritation would be gone. So that is one of several medicinal uses for the mesquite. An edible part would be 2. It would be the flower or the flowers. When the mature flower gets this orangey yellow look, more orangey, it's edible, but the taste is very, very mild. If you want a little sharper taste, then you would select these ones that are a little yellow in color. These flowers are older than these ones. These ones are just now starting to open. And then if you wanted something a little tartar, if you wanted to make a salad or garnish a piece of meat or something with a little tartar taste, you would use these flowers. The flower buds have not opened yet. They're still green, and it has a little tartar taste. You would simply just collect them off the tree. You could eat them raw, or you could mix them with salads or soups, casseroles. You could, if you were making some kind of pan de campo, you could strip them and put them in the pan de campo, so that you could eat them that way. Later on in the summer, these flowers then give rise to seed pods they vary in length, which are called the mesquites. And the mesquites can be removed from the tree when they're ripe. They're multicolored, red, purplish, yellowish. You remove them and you can chew the pod, extract the juice, and remove the seeds. Mesquites are 30 to 33% sugar. And the sugar in plants and fruits are composed mainly of fructose, sucrose, and galactose. And all those 3 sugars are simple sugars. So when you take those sugars and you dissolve them into your saliva and swallow them, they get into your system immediately. So you get energy right away. Unlike eating a piece of steak where you get long-lasting energy from protein, simple sugars give you a burst of power right away. It doesn't last very long, but hey, you're traveling, there's mesquites all over the place, so whenever you ran out of gas, so to speak, you were getting tired and ran out of energy, you could eat more mesquite. So that was one of the ways. If you had a camp, then you could use the mesquites to make mesquite jelly. Again, when you make the jelly, you can preserve, so you can make it. You could use some rocks, and you could pound the mesquite beans on the rocks, and you could make it into a flour. Or if those days they had a metate, they would put the seed pods in the metate, and they would work it, and then they would collect the flour, and from the flour they could make a porridge. There would be, le decían mezquitamal. They would just boil some water and put the flour in there. No sugar required, because you already have about 33% sugar. So you would make a very nice atole, very, very sweet, and it has sort of like a caramelly taste to it. You could make pan de mesquite. We know that the indigenous people would grind the mesquite pods and make flour. And we know that because when Cabeza de Vaca crossed the Rio Grande, he mentions in his writings that the indigenous people on this side of the river met him at the river and handed him 20 loaves of bread made from mesquite. So we know that even back then, they already knew how to use the mesquite. Of course, later on, the farmers and ranchers probably learned from the Indians that were here a longer time, and they would make any kind of sweet bread. Yeah, you could mix it with tortillas. You could make any kind. So The mesquite has lots of uses, the mesquite pot itself, for livestock, for other animals. But the mesquite tree, the root, the green roots, are flexible but very strong. So the Indians would cut long pieces of it. They would strip the bark, and if they needed to with fire, they would give it a natural shape, and they would use them to construct real good, powerful bows for hunting and for... They probably used a combination of lechuguilla and yucca and other fibers to make the twine, and later on they could strip the hide off of animals and used it for the string. So it was a very, very important crop that had long uses because they could preserve the mesquite pods for long periods of time. They also, when the mesquite pods were ripe, one of the things that they would do is they would dig a pit in the ground. They would dump all the mesquite, they would take a big pole, mesquite limb, and they would pound it, and they would make sort of like a dough, and it would be mixed with dirt and all kinds of stuff. And they would roll it in their hands, and they would make these mesquite balls that I call. Then they would put them on a hot surface, either on the dirt or rocks. They would dehydrate them, and they would get solid and very hard, and they could transport those. They were very easy to carry. Whenever they were hungry, they would take one of these balls and put it in there. They get fiber, lots of sugar, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D in a little compact thing that they could carry. So they had many, many uses for the mesquite, and we still do today. Aside from things that were used for food, some other plants that were used for medicine is this thorny shrub. It has thorns, and some of them have thorns on the thorns, and this is called, in Mexico, across the Rio Grande, or the Rio Bravo, they call this besberinda. On this side of the border, we call it amargoso or amargosa, and this is the cure that I was talking to about for Montezuma's revenge, or for amoebic dysentery. The way you would use this plant is you would just cut little pieces, twigs, the thorns, leaves, and again you would use a handful, like maybe 2 of these branches chopped up into little pieces, to about 3 cups of boiling water. Another one that it's very difficult to separate because it's also a medicinal plant. The pads have been proven to be extremely effective to lower your low density protein. Those of you that have cholesterol, you have the bad cholesterol, you might have a very high reading, and they have actually experimented with people who have high cholesterol. Then they've given them nopalitos in many different shapes and forms so that you could change the flavors and keep on eating them, and your cholesterol level just comes down like crazy. Some plants that were used, that grow in Europe, when the Spaniards came to this country, they didn't bring the plant with them because they were explorers. They didn't care anything about growing stuff. They mainly were conquerors. They wanted to conquer and explore. But they brought the knowledge with them. And one plant that comes to mind that the Spaniards brought here was Ephedra anticephalitica. It's a plant species that has a very wide range. It's a very, very old plant. It predates the angiosperms, which is all these flowering plants, by at least 20 million years. So it's a very, very old plant, and it still survives. It's still here with us. We can find it here in the brush. And Ephedra anticephalitica has a substance in that plant that was used to cure venereal diseases. When the Spaniards came to this country, they brought along with them syphilis, and they passed it on to the indigenous people. The indigenous people did not have it. They didn't know a cure for it because they didn't have the disease. Well, the Spaniards had both the cure, or the remedy, and the disease. So when they brought here and they passed this illness to the indigenous people also learned that they used this particular plant. They would make a tea. It's also called Mormon tea, or popote in Spanish. They would make a tea to cure, and hence the The name Ephedra is the genus, but the species is Anticephaletica because it was used as an anti for syphilis. So that's one of the examples of some of the knowledge that was brought here. The indigenous people, of course, they lived off the land. They gave names to plants such as anacahuita. The name anacahuita is Nahuatl. It's from the Aztec name. When the Spaniards came here, this plant did not grow in Europe. They didn't know it. They heard the guys called it anacahuita, so they called it anacahuita. Later on, when the ranchers started to ranch this area, here again, they couldn't use a name because they didn't know it. The Spaniards called it anacahuita. The indigenous called it anacahuita. So now we know it as anacahuita. Goes back from the Aztecs. That's how far this name on this plant. So they had information flowing from the indigenous people to the earlier settlers, more coming this way than going that way. Why? Because these people lived here and they knew the plants and they had uses for them. The people that immigrated into this country might have had other plants that they used that they didn't grow here. So the amount of knowledge that they brought here was limited and they couldn't survive, so they depended on the indigenous people for that wealth of information. When my grandfather was my age and he lived here in this land, what I know now today was common knowledge to all. If you didn't know what I know, you wouldn't survive. It was that simple. If you survived this area, it's because you knew, you had the knowledge. Unfortunately, as they pass away, they take that information with them, and it's decreasing. We're constantly losing. Every time somebody passes away, the knowledge is dwindling onto who knows. Some of it has been recorded, some of it has not. So that's important. But the wealth of information was from the indigenous people here because that's what they needed. This is the environment that they lived in. They learned it from the uses that they had from here. The aloe vera plant, before it became with a high use, the nopal was used in substitute of the aloe vera. So to treat burns, they used it for headaches, they used it for a lot of the same ailments that the aloe vera or the aloe vera plant is used now. The cactus had that use. We do have some aloe veras that are native to this region, but they grow, the populations are so small that their use never got to where it is now. Now that it's farmed and harvested in large amounts, the use has expanded. In those days, the use, if used at all, was very limited. The nopal took almost all the use that the aloe vera is used for today. The nopal had the substitute use for the nopal. It was flourished everywhere, and that's how that it was used. So we have some that were introduced, and we do have native aloe veras, but the native aloe vera is not as juicy and it's not as prolific as the one that was introduced, so therefore the uses were minor. We had some plants that had minor uses but were important uses, but nonetheless minor. Some plants that had a minor use that were used for ceremonies were like the mezcal bean or the Texas mountain laurel. Grows a lot of it in North Texas, but it also grows in this region. It has a hard seed, a red seed. It's also known as frijolillo. And I recall when I was little, we would find the little seeds in school grounds or whatever, and we'd take it and we'd rub it against the concrete, and then you could burn somebody because it retains heat. That's a poisonous plant. It has a certain amount of toxic material, but the shaman, the medicine man, needed to communicate with the underworld or with spirits, and one of the ways that they could do it was by taking frijolillo seeds. They would put them in water. The poisonous material would dissolve into the water. Then they would drink it, and they knew how to gauge it. They knew a fine line between poisonous and just where it would get them to hallucinate. And they would drink it up to that point, and then they would have visions of the future or what things to do. So some of them that were poisonous were used for ceremonial or for religious purposes. Other ones were used to cure things. So there was a wide range of uses. Some studies have indicated that in our culture we're losing a lot of the information because our grandparents used it and now we don't use it. In fact, some surveys have been done and it seems like originally it appears that the knowledge of some of the more common medicinal uses of plants has gone down because the younger generation know nothing at all. But when you look more into the data, it shows a pattern that when the young daughter gets married, they would ask her, do you know any uses for amargoso? No. Do you know any uses for anacahuita? No. Do you know any uses for mesquite? No. They would ask the mother, do you know any uses for anacahuita? Oh yes, it's used for this and that. Amargosa? Yes. Mesquite? Yes. But when the daughter marries and has kids, and the kid has colic, and she doesn't know what, she calls mother, Mother, my son is sick and it's got colic, what should I do? Then the mother tells her, Mijita, go to the monte and get some besberinda and make a tea, it's probably amoebas. So even though it looks like we're losing it, somehow, and it happens mainly with daughters, once they have a family of their own, they revert back to the source of information, their mothers or their grandparents, so that knowledge is somehow staying with us. It has been with us for millions of years. Ever since there was man and plants, they probably started having uses for it. So it's going like this, but I have a feeling that it's not coming up. The peaks are getting smaller as we go, and only the more common plants that treat the more common diseases, especially on babies, will probably retain that information for hundreds of years. But a lot of the more unique, more important ones are the ones that we'll be losing. We're losing fast. If somebody broke an arm and we needed to put a sling, if we needed to build a teepee or tie up some branches so that we could put other debris and make a little shelter, we would build a fire. Because of the interest of saving time and everything, I'm using this little Bunsen burner to demonstrate. And then I can use this plant that's growing right here, which is a native plant. It's called a yucca or pita. And I'm just going to take my knife I'm going to harvest one leaf. And this is only a demonstration, but let's say there was 20 of us. So we could harvest, several hundred leaves. We would cut this thorn for safety reasons so we wouldn't get harmed. We already have enough troubles because we would be lost, so we want to avoid any other injury. If we didn't have any means of building a fire, we could do it without a fire. But it works much, much better with a fire. So I'm going to, what I'm doing right now is I'm just simply heating this yucca. And the reason I'm doing it is because when I'm heating it, the little cells are bursting. And it's making the plant a lot softer or pliable, and that's what I want. We want to make a rope or string, so we want something that we can work with, and we don't need it to be stiff. We need it to be real soft, and this is one of the ways that we can do it. It's a very simple process. We just roast it just a little bit. It doesn't take hardly any time. Roast it on both sides. You can tell it's already changing to a paler green color, and that's what we want. Like I said, if we were lost and we needed, if somebody got hurt, if we needed to, maybe there was a horse around and we needed transportation, but first we needed to catch it and tie it, we could make the rope this way. A lot of us would be doing this, so we could weave several of these strands together to make one that would be pretty tough. If we just needed a piece of string, we could just use it by itself. I've already roasted half. I'm going to switch over and do the other half. It's very easy to tell when it's ready because it turns from a pale green. You can see like a little cloud disappearing, and it gets of a different color green, and then it gets this yellowish color. And I do both sides just to reach the surface quicker, but you could do it in one side. With lots of hands and a little fire, we could do a long rope in no time at all. It's a very quick process. The leaves are fairly large, so we already have an advantage. Okay, this is pretty much ready. So now we have this, and it's already roasted. I would take a rock or a stick. I happen to have a knife, so I'll just take my knife. And I'm just going to separate probably several hundred strings at a time by making little slits. I work my way across from one end to the other. And then it's a simple process of just simply tearing this. You just tear it up. And like I said, with many hands, you could do a whole bunch of this together. In fact, we would form a little assembly line, and some would be roasting, others would be tying. Now, I'm going to take a thick end, which comes from the base of the plant, and a thin end, which comes from the tip, simply because I want to reduce the mass, and this gives me not so thick on one end and so thin in the other end. And I just tie a simple knot, just a little square knot. And I can do this, I'm going to do about 3 of them. Again, I take these ends and I flip them upside down so I can get a thick one and a thin one and tie a knot. You can tell that it's very, very soft already. It's very pliable. And that's what I was looking for. I wanted something that was very, very pliable. And I'm going to do one more. Again, I turn it upside down. I tie thick end with narrow end. And that gives me a thick end and narrow end at the other side. If somebody by this time would have gathered some mesquite branches or something, and we would put them like this, and then we could tie this, and we could tie them together. If we needed, like I said, maybe there was a horse loose, and we needed to capture the horse, we needed a rope, then, and of course this is not long enough for a rope, but I was careful to invert them so that I get a thick end and a shallow end. So again, I can take the other one that I prepared, thick end, narrow end, same process, and I would tie those together. And I'm just going to do one more, thick end, narrow end on this side, and tie them together. And the length is up to you, however long. So right here, I've already made maybe 7 feet, at least 7 feet in almost no time at all. But this is not enough, but we could always double it, quadruple it, however many we wanted. And then if we had the time, we would weave them. If we didn't have the time, we would just twist them like a rope. And we could take this, which are 4, then we can take another 4 and twist them together, and then we have a very, very strong rope. So this was fiber. You could weave baskets. If you were out collecting, say, tunas, the fruit from the prickly pear, we need a basket. We could weave a basket out of this. If we were going to weave a basket, we probably don't want it this pliable. We would not roast it. We would just cut the strands, make a basket. Let's say we were traveling, the sun was blaring down on us, we needed a hat, we would make a hat. We would do a blanket, we could weave it and make like a tapete, we could make a little bedroll. So it had many, many, many uses. This is strong, but it's not as strong as some of the other natural fibers that we have. This plant is an agave. It's called lechuguilla in Spanish. Unlike the yucca, it has a yellow band in the center, and then it has this really mean, sort of like a cat claw, thorns on the side. And of course it has a real sharp point. So one of the things I do before I start is I remove those, because we don't want to add injury to the trouble that we're already in. And I'm just taking a very thin sliver. I don't want to remove any of the meaty part. I just want to remove the thorns. So I've got that part, and then I'll do this side, and then I'm going to get that tip, which is very, very sharp. I'm going to remove that. And it leaves me with this very small leaf. But even though it's very small, the fiber is very strong. If you visit Mexico, you go to the market or almost anywhere, and you will find rope, mecate, the hemp rope. And hemp rope is, you find it a lot. It might be 3/4 of an inch or maybe an inch in diameter. And then you look for a riata, a lariat that they use for roping. Well, the lariat might be maybe like my index finger, 1/2 inch or so. And yet the lariat is much stronger than this 1-inch hemp rope. The lariat is made out of this plant, lechuguilla. The way they made the the lechuguilla rope, is they would put the fibers like this. They would overlap them, and then they would twist them like I did the yucca, and they would make un cordón. Y luego they would take many cordones and twist them together until they got the lariat. I'm going to show you the fiber content of the lechuguilla. The traditional way to extract it would be, you would get a big rock and get a small, very comfortable, smooth rock, and then you would simply do this to it. I'm just like fire, I'm bursting up all the little cells. I want to be careful not to break the fiber. I'm just bursting the cells. I can remove this little outer layer, and what I'm doing is I'm exposing the fiber. And it is just loaded with tiny, tiny little fibers. But like I said, nonetheless, even though they're small, they're very strong fibers. It's like little pieces of hilo or sewing thread. I think you can see, I'm trying to pull one here. Right here, this is a single strand that is much, much thinner than a strand of hair. But nonetheless, it's real strong. And when we, like I said, we take a couple of hundred of these little strands, which wouldn't take hardly any volume because they're so thin, and weave those together, or just twist them together, and then we take another couple of hundred and weave them together, pretty soon we have a solid, very solid rope. This plant had another use. You can use this as a soap substitute. The yucca, by the way, is probably one of the best soap substitutes. The roots are. You dig up the roots of the yucca, and they're almost as equal as this one. If you go to a market, they still use it in Mexico. They call it amol, A-M-O-L-E. And that is the root of the lechuguilla. They dig it up. It has kind of a darkish brown, blackish roots. Sort of look like peanuts. They chop them up and they let them dry. And then you would use to wash whatever you wanted. So it had a use for fiber, and it also had a use as a soap substitute. What if we needed to write a note? We were lost somewhere and there was a little area, a little abandoned ranch or something. We needed to write a note. We could make paper the way that the Aztecas, the Aztecs, made paper by using this mother lode. This is another agave. This is agave americano or agave americanus. This is the native from South Texas. It has this bluish tinge to it. The agave mexicano is a little bit shorter and it's green. It's very, very dark green. They can both be used for making paper. Again, like the lechuguilla, it has this real sharp spikes here at the tip, so I'm going to take them off. One of the first things I do is take them off to avoid an injury. Make sure I get all of them. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. As I'm cutting, I'm having trouble because it's really stringy, and I'm cutting into some of the strings not at the same angle, and it's pulling, but it has just loaded and loaded and loaded with strings. I'm going to take this few off right here. Then I'm going to cut the tip, because I don't want to hurt myself. Having done that, then right off here at the margin, I can pull some of the strings. This leaf, it's much bigger than the lechuguilla or the yucca, so I get bigger strands. Lots of them. I mean, this is just millions of them compared to maybe hundreds or thousands from the other ones. So this was also used for making string, rope, but one of the main uses was for making paper. They would, with rocks, they would hit it, and they would, unlike the other fiber, I was not trying to damage it. On this one, they would actually break it. They would chop it up and chop it up and chop it up and make more like a mush out of it. And then they would put it in a shallow pool or something. They would scatter it, and automatically all those little tiny fibers kind of weave into each other. And then they would pull it out, or when the little pool, the water evaporated, it left a sheet of paper that then they could cut and use natural dyes to write with. Or in fact, the codex that the Aztecs wrote were written on paper made out of this agave. Another thing that the agave is used for is to make a very nourishing drink, probably even better than orange juice. And that is, right in the center, all these leaves are bind together, and as it becomes time for them to separate, one of them will start to move over, and it leaves all the center ones, and then another one, another. That's for growth of the plant. When the plant reaches maturity, all those leaves that were together kind of merge, and it forms a stalk, and it can grow anywhere from a foot to 18 inches per day. So it grows very, very, very fast. The indigenous people figured out that this thing, since it grows so fast, it can get up to 20, 25 feet. It must have a lot of food stored in there to be doing that. So when it was about this high, that center stalk, they would take a sharp tool, a rock, and they would cut it out and remove it. Then they would make a depression, sort of like the shape of a bowl. And if they would do it in the afternoon, by the next day in the morning, that depression would be full of liquid, because it's very active. It's putting a lot of material for the stalk, but the stalk is not there anymore. So it adds up maybe 3 liters, maybe as much as a gallon per day. So it was very productive. And it's very rich in vitamin A, vitamin C. It has actual amino acids. So it's much better than orange juice. So when things were tough, here they provided a very nourishing drink from this thing. After, if they had done several plants and they had some left over, they would dump it in a vessel, and they would let it ferment, and they would make pulque, sort of like a beer, for special celebrations or ceremonies. When they learned how to distill, then they could distill the water out of the pulque and concentrate the alcohol, and they made tequila. So they made paper from this particular thing. They used the drink was very, very nourishment that they could use, and they also made beer. When they learned how to distill, then they make tequila out of it. One of the things that that I want to have an impact on is the preservation of our culture and of our way of life. I personally feel we cannot protect our culture or our way of life unless we protect our surroundings, which is our environment. And when school kids come here, it's amazing to me how little they know about our natural environment. I mean, I would think that they're here from Stark County, that they would know mesquites and ébanos and retamas, some of the animals. And a couple of weeks ago, I had a group, and there was a lizard that ran across the road, and the majority of them yelled, "Iguana!" I said, "Iguana?" Obviously, they're watching TV about things that have nothing to do with our culture and our surrounding. So what I'm trying to do is to bring focus. Yes, it's nice to learn about the lions in Africa and about the whales and all these other things, the penguins, and it's nice to learn about those. But we need to focus on who we are, where did we come from, and what our environment is. And I have a strong feeling that neither can we preserve our culture nor learn about that ancient way of life unless we preserve the environment, because this is it. It'd be like trying to preserve history and burning all the history books. There goes the history. Well, by maintaining this environment, it's like maintaining all the books in a history library. We have all the history here. In fact, when I have students, I tell them, imagine walking through a library and you see stacks and stacks and stacks with hundreds and thousands of books, and you're walking between the aisles and you're looking and they're just books. They have no meaning, they have nothing, they're just books. But then you stop and you pull a book out and you read about Huckleberry Finn, or you read about history, or it's a whole story right here in this little book. So that's the way our monte is. If you don't know what you're doing, it's just thorny stuff that has no meaning to you. It's just stuff, I mean, just green stuff. But when you have somebody explain to you, it gives a significance to it. When you attach a significance and a story and a purpose behind our native vegetation, we develop a connection, and maybe it will inspire us to preserve it rather than to just let it go.